Before I begin, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank ETS and the Awards Committee for inviting me to give the Messick Memorial Lecture this year. It's a great honour and privilege, and I hope that the little bit that I can offer in this will contribute in some way towards our discussion of validity worlds and how values can be incorporated into our understanding of validity and validation. Alfred North Whitehead once commented that the history of Western philosophy was but a footnote to Plato. Of course, he went on, and the quotation is up here for you, that he meant by that not that Plato had said everything there was to say, but it was a matter of dealing with the wealth of general ideas scattered throughout Plato's writing. And my contention in this lecture is that in a similar way, validity theory since 1989 is largely a footnote to Messick in very much the same way. As I go through, you'll see I've put barcodes up, QR codes like the one here. If you have another device that can scan QR codes, then please, when these come up, just scan them and you will be able to download additional information. This first one here is for the slides, but it will reappear. The structure of this lecture is fairly straightforward. What I want to argue is that there are value components in everything we do in testing and assessment. And this grows out of the work that Fred Davids and I have done over the years on effect-driven testing. And we have argued that effect-driven testing is ethical in that it looks to the future and it tries to predict what we think the effects of testing, the consequences will be for society, for individuals, and that should be incorporated into what we do, even at the design stage of tests. I want to look at values and validation in Messick. I think Messick has a clear value structure, and I'll try to explain that. But there was a problem that arose because of the link, the explicit link, between the value system and some aspects of construct validation. And partly because of that, and for other reasons, there has been a fragmentation in validation theory since 1989, and I think 4 validity worlds have reacted to Messick. And I think that they have attempted in some ways to improve on Messick, but for the most part we've actually lost more than we have gained through this fragmentation. And then I'm going to turn to effect-driven testing and talking about how we can reintegrate values and retain all that is good in Messick and counteract everything we've lost since then. So what are the value components that I think we have in testing? Well, first of all, on the right hand side you'll see that I've put validity investigation. This is the stuff we do to investigate validity. Sometimes it's post hoc, sometimes it's driven from the beginning in the design processes, but these are the things that we actually do. The consequences of test use for people and society, of course, was introduced in Messick's progressive matrix. And the value components that kind of affect that are how we understand and interpret constructs, what notion of truth we are working with in our approach to validity, how we see society, what values do we associate with different structures in society and how society is organized. Of course, the most important of these is meritocracy, and if one believes in a meritocracy, then testing becomes, an assessment becomes an engine for issues like social mobility. Next is how we perceive individuals, what we think an individual is. And the last one are power structures, which of course have been brought to the fore in constructivist approaches to validity and validation. I've put the approaches to validity, examining validity, in frameworks, in a framework. So in this case it's a picture. So I'm not going to dwell on this because this is the Messick consensus, which we arrived at around 1989, and we know in subsequent years it's been incorporated into the standards for educational and psychological assessment. And the 6 areas everybody is familiar with, so I'm not going to dwell on them. The substantive, I will just say the substantive area for the substantive aspect for Messick, he does actually talk about process models and process engagement, which is often missed in that part of it. We have the external, the convergent and discriminant evidence, structural, how the internal structure of tests and assessments reflect constructs, the content of the test, generalizability, and of course the consequential validity, which we will look into a little bit more in a future slide. And of course he introduced the progressive matrix, which said that the consequential use of tests, the consequences of test use, included construct validity. So this is what I take to be Messick's value structure. I think this is evident from his writing in that constructs, which of course is at the centre of Messick's thought, are contingent explanatory concepts, and these account for consistencies that are observed in performance and data. The constructs indicate in themselves values because we label them as explanatory concepts and thereby convey to users and to test takers the kinds of things that we value. Within this, truth is the outcome of scientific investigation of score meaning, which I think is what Messick is essentially getting at through the 6 aspects of construct validity that he lists. His concept of society is a meritocratic one, and his extensive discussion of distributive justice as an engine for meritocracy shows this to be the case. So the role of testing and assessment and language testing is one of supporting the fair and equitable selection of individuals to receive what are essentially limitedly available goods and services. Individuals are therefore framed as citizens in a meritocracy, and the locus of power is with society itself, in that individuals must comply with the conditions in order to receive rewards. But underlying this, of course, is the assumption that we do enable social mobility through the use of testing to operate the values of a meritocracy. And when it comes to consequences, Messick is, to a certain extent, ambivalent. And the reason for this, and one of the quotation I've given here, is that he links it directly to the meaning of test scores, and of course that is construct validity. And Messick is very explicit then in saying that, the quotation on the right, relevance and utility as well as appropriateness of test use depend, or should depend, on score meaning. Now, this is where Messick has opened up to a certain extent a debate that is ongoing and has led to the fracturing of validity theory. Because on the one hand, Messick wishes to talk about consequences and ethics in testing, But on the other hand, he wishes to tie those consequences directly to the relevance and utility of scores for particular uses, and he sees relevance and utility as being issues of the meaning of scores or of construct validity, so that only outcomes, whether they are intended or non-intended, that are negative, are of consequence if they can be traced to sources of test invalidity. And this is a fault line which we see running through the rest of validity theory, post-Messick. And in this fractured validity world, I identify 4 emergent types of validity, some of which refer to previous approaches to validation. But these are Instrumentalism, Technicalism, New Realism, and Constructivism. And what I want to do is to work through each of these and explain, in terms of the value systems, how I think these have changed Messick and why I think there are problems with all of them. The first of these responses to Messick is what we currently know as argument-based approaches to validation. And the fact that we move from terminology like validity to validation is very, very appropriate, because this is about process. Within the framework of validation, how we go about it, the basic process is description of target content and domain variables, and the replication, as far as we can do so, in test content. We then observe performances and see whether or not those performances are elicited by the test content at a level which is deemed to be sufficient to say that a test taker is competent. And we go from observation to observed score to universe score and target score, and this is an interpretive argument supported by a validation argument, or many validation arguments. Let's look at the values that go with this. First of all, constructs. Constructs are not seen as useful, and it's quite clear in the work around argument-based validation processes that naming things is seen as problematic. Naming constructs, how do we identify them? Perhaps we start to think that they really exist, and this is the fallacy of reification. So construct language is not used very much in validation approaches that are process-based. And the same is true of truth. I have always been very impressed by the philosophical side of the argument-based approach to validation. And the fact that, say, Kane in his 2013 work can say that plausibility and justification rather than truth are the focus shows just how much this is process-based. So in terms of society, what is just in a society is the outcome of establishing following established procedure. And we can see that this, in a sense, becomes very legalistic. So that individuals, when we look at, well, how do individuals fit into this, they're subject to agreed legal processes, and these are established by society, and in this case it's test designers and score users. And so power in this system is the expert authority. And so we have essentially what is a legalistic system. Now, one of the issues with this is as far as Messick is concerned, is that it kind of pushes Messick's construct validity out. But I'd like to argue here that in actual fact, what we've done is to appropriate Toulmin argument structure in order to organize Messick style aspects and information. Now, in this particular validation argument, which is taken from the TOEFL project, TOEFL IBT project, we can see there that the rebuttals in the argument, in other words, those potential facts or data that would make the claim unjustifiable, are in fact almost always constructed from Messick's aspects. And I think this was actually first pointed out by Lyle Bachman in his excellent 2005 paper on how to incorporate values in argument-based validation processes. And Bachman says that explicitly, rebuttals constitute alternative explanations or counterclaims to the intended inference. In a validity argument, these counterclaims correspond to potential sources of invalidity that may result in what Messick referred to as construct irrelevant variance and construct underrepresentation. So in Toulmin style argument structure, which form the basis of these validation arguments, the rebuttals are essentially drawn from Messick's notions of construct irrelevant variance and construct underrepresentation. And I agree completely with Lyle on this, which leads me to think that the appropriation of Toulmin argument structure is a useful means of organizing some of Messick's components, but is not a complete rejection of any of them. There is a QR code here. If you'd like to scan it, I've also shown in a handout here how Messick can be used to interpret and understand interpretive arguments as well. So what we're dealing with here are process rules that says that what we do is look at how rules are implemented, how we structure arguments, and this is a legalistic approach. And it's a matter of due process. So the model of society, how we understand truth, but truth is not there, is process-based. And you can see here that from some of the quotations I've got, that we are firmly in the area of looking at how a process is followed, and if a process is followed properly, then the outcome is useful. And I think that's what is meant when Keynes says that utility is more important than truth. The second area that I've investigated is what I've called technicalism. And to understand this, I've actually selected an example, which is in the picture frame, from the work of Cyril Weir. And essentially, what I think technicalism is a checklist quality control approach to validation. So what we're doing here is producing a long list of things that we look at for each and every test that we have, and the test uses to which those tests are put. Now, in technicalism, constructs are anything that, as Weir states, is related to what end users want to know about the test. So it's about the needs of end users and the information which they can possibly use to justify the test use. Truth is a matter of taking these checklists and using them to list, essentially, all of the things that you have investigated. So the lists themselves become critically important. The kind of view of society that we get from this is bureaucratic. It's the application of product checklists. And this is where we get lots of discussion about quality compliance and how we check tests as if they were little machines that have to roll off the product line and be checked to make sure that they match the appropriate quality levels and standards that have been set. Within this, individuals are consumers of testing products, and they're framed in the terms of the needs of the end users. So they are workers or travellers or immigrants, or however the end users are going to use these scores. And here we're talking about referent power. It's derived from trust and respect in the organisation that operates the quality control systems. You can see that this value structure is essentially one of commercialisation and quality control and trust in the producers. It's a commercial model. I've got some quotations again to support some of this analysis, and I think it leads to what Cronbach would have called dragnet empiricism, and that is that what we do in this context is collect as many facts as we can about everything on the list, and the claim from people working in validation that have used this kind of approach is that to address a validity question, you must address every single item on the list. And this is, because it's a commercial model, it leads to a claim that this is confirmatory primarily, and that it is confirmatory for the uses to which end users wish to put tests. And testing systems that rely on technical approaches tend to make these claims explicitly, as I've tried to show in these quotations as well, at least in one of them. The third is the New Realism. New Realism is a real throwback to the past. I think it goes all the way back to Cattell and Galton. In that, what we do is we specify constructs. The constructs are seen as real. They exist independently. They're not concepts that are summaries of what we think are consistencies in data or observations. They are real latent traits that live in individuals or exist in individuals. So the constructs are specified as psychologically real. Test procedures are specified, data gathered. We have hypotheses, and if these hypotheses are correct, then we claim that the test is valid. And this is not the validation of score uses. It is the test is a valid interpretation, a valid measure of the construct, such that if the score is higher, the presence of the trait is higher, and so on. It is indexical. So that's the constructs. They exist independently. Truth is whether the measurement is sensitive to changes in the attribute. It's as simple as that. In this model, society is completely irrelevant to establishing truth or test use. We're not interested in society, and individuals, there's no interest whatsoever in how individuals communicate with each other. And the power structure is that of the expert scientist, in this case the psychometrician, the psychologist. This is a value structure that I refer to as mental mining. And as I said, it goes all the way back to Cattell and Galton. And in one of the quotations here from Boersboom and colleagues in 2004, the claim here is a reaction to Messick. You know, validity is not complex. It's not faceted. Social consequences are irrelevant. It's nice and simple for them. It's whether or not the test measures what it purports to measure. And this is essentially a 19th century concept, but it is in resurgence. My fourth approach to the fracturing of validity is that of constructivism. This is a completely different reaction to Messick. In this case, constructivism primarily says that consequences are everything. So in terms of test use, if we take Messick's progressive matrix and we take the test use social consequences, using an analysis drawn from the philosopher Ian Hacking, he would say we look at the use of something in society, and our first assumption under constructivism is we say X, in this case the use of this test, is taken for granted. It appears to be inevitable. And then what constructivism does is to really investigate why this has occurred. If we go to step one from zero and we say X need not have existed, could be different, we're looking at the contingency of this as a social phenomenon and saying, why has it happened? The next step is to say X is bad. Now, in this particular case, what we're saying is that we're moving into the rebel territory of saying what we need to do here is say that we've got to be highly critical of this. We may do it, but we do it with care, as Ilana Shahami would say. But these things are bad. If we move to 3, we say we will be better off if X did not exist or were radically changed. And this is the revolutionary stance. We're in open revolt against the system, and our analysis of how these things are used is one of looking at how power is used to coerce people. So if we look at the value system of constructivism, constructs are value-laden. Some people would even go as far as to say that constructs are socially constructed through the act of testing. In other words, constructs have no meaning. They're not even summary concepts. They are things which arise and have meaning only in context. Truth, with Nietzsche, there are no facts. Everything is elusive, and truth only emerges through our opinions and our experiences and then evaporates again. So society is structured through language and the machinery of power, and it's all about maintaining status and values of the elite. And individuals within these societies are, for the most part, unless they're part of the elite, marginalized and subjugated by these value systems. And the power structures in society are coercive and requiring compliance. If you don't comply, then you are not given the opportunities in society because you simply don't. You don't fit in with the existing power structure. So the validation process is about articulating the value implications of test constructs and revealing and undermining the ideologies and policy agendas that go with them. This, of course, is a standpoint epistemology. What we're doing is looking as individuals and often as marginalized groups at these ideologies, and what we're trying to do is to undermine, investigate and undermine the power structures created by the elites in society. With this, I have seen investigations associated with this where we approach testing from a point of view of ethnicity, maybe of gender, of sexuality, and we look at tests and see whether or not they support some of these agendas. So, for example, one analysis is of TOEIC, the test of English as international communication, as being an expression of neoliberal economics. And some of the analyses of the CFR, the Common European Framework of Reference, which of course is not a test but a framework, but that has been analysed as furthering the ideology of globalization. In each of these four fractured approaches to validation, we have gains and losses. In the case of instrumentalism and argument-structured, argument-based approaches to validation, what we gain is a structure to organise Messick-type evidence. And I think the appropriation of Toulmin argument structure has been very useful in talking about approaches to validation. One of the claims, of course, was that Messick didn't say how we did validation. I don't think that's strictly speaking true, but it is one of the claims. But we lose more than we gain. I think the loss of construct language is very, very unfortunate, because we do need abstract nouns that summarise what we observe and how we interpret it. And I'm not very happy with the loss of truth claims and only plausibility, even though we acknowledge that we never have ultimate truth, but only justified warrants. Technicalism is, I find, very unattractive. What we gain are extensive checklists of things we could investigate if we had time, resources and inclination. Sometimes I like checklists. I'm glad they use them when they look at my car every year. And sometimes I like lists when I go to the supermarket. But I don't have the same list every time I go because I have different purposes. And in this, we really lose Hartel's notion of addressing the weakest part of the validity argument. I like Cronbach's term dragnet empiricism. It's talking about everything that we could possibly look at. And consequences are, of course, an afterthought in all of this. The primary focus is getting that checklist checked. If you think I'm wrong about this, look at some of the books that have been written using a technicalist approach. And essentially what we have in many of those are lists of facts, unconnected studies, there is no cohesive argument in the same way that there would be in an instrumentalist approach to validation. Real realism, the new real realism, we gain an interesting construct definition, but this is just far too, it's a throwback to the past, and taking out everything that has been done in understanding how tests are used socially, and the interpersonal elements in, say, assessing speaking, all of this is gone. I think that the consequences for society and individuals and removing those from scientific projects is just no longer feasible nor desirable. When it comes to constructivism, I like constructivism in the sense that we get passionate, well-argued social analysis. What we lose is a grasp on reality as we push forward these standpoint epistemologies for individuals and groups, and most of whom have experience of marginalization. And so the world is seen from that perspective. Now, that doesn't take away from what we're learning from them, but it doesn't really help us to understand how we go about validating tests. So I believe that Messick's validity world was more coherent and balanced than the four fractured approaches that I've discussed, but his one failing was to be ambivalent about consequences. Cronbach was not so ambivalent. What he said was that validation should include the questions of obligation or responsibility for adverse consequences, whether or not they could be traced to issues of test invalidity, or as Messick would put that, relevance and utility. We must step outside that. This next part may actually surprise some of you. I think the one language tester who genuinely did this and incorporated values into his understanding of test design and use was Robert Lardo. And I offer you these two quotations in support of this. You see, he's talking here both about society, but society in terms of the human race and how we understand society and our place in it. And built into this, these wonderful quotations from Lardo. I really wish people would read Lardo these days. He's been done a great disservice by the British-based communicative testing movement. He really is a wonderful writer, of course, of his time, and we have moved beyond some of it. Here he looks at issues of equality and of similar experiences, and also about cultural diversity, that people are different even though they share so much. And for Lardo, this fed into his model of intercultural communication. It's a model that we don't look at very much nowadays, but we should do. And he has two people interacting through language. And because of those differences he talks about, cultural meaning, how we encode meaning differently, and how we bring our own meaning to the use of language. The most important thing here is that it's the encoding of meaning, which is both cultural and individual in language, as a means of communication between people who are part of the same culture, part of the same race, have the same desires, and for whom language is the means of interacting and growth, individual growth, and friendship. And all of that is in Lardo. I like to relate this to Charles Sanders Peirce's concept of evolutionary love. And this is that there are some things about humans which Lardo recognized that are essentially part of our shared evolutionary existence. And language is the quintessential example of this. It is a uniquely human ability, and the ability to understand meaning in the context of society, which is cooperative and collaborative, is the ultimate goal of the use of language. And Lardo expresses this exceptionally clearly. Let me give you one example, and it's one example I've worked on for a long time, which is fluency. Now, I don't want to dwell on this. Fluency is an old topic, and now it could be something very different. But when I first started writing about fluency in the late 1980s and early 90s, of course it was a hot topic at that time. In the left-hand box, I've listed the temporal variables and the disfluency markers very briefly that have been used in the literature to examine fluency. And these are things that are observable, they're measurable, so words per minute and so on. Okay? Now, we can take those and we can use low inference categories, and we can say these are directly indicative of some kind of language processing. These are low inference categories. These are used also in modern approaches which are usually termed cognitive approaches to examining fluency. So the more of words per minute you have, the more fluent you are. The longer the unfilled or filled pauses, the less fluent you are, and so on. And the reason for doing this is that these are things that computers can score. Now, let me turn to a more Lardo-ish approach to this, and that is that we move to high inference categories. These things are not just indicators of how we process things in our minds. That's a real realist approach. In my work, I've looked at high inference categories. How do we use these for turn-taking, for content planning, for listing things verbally? How do we express propositional uncertainty? And so on. You can see the list of high inference categories that we have used. And this leads to real-world rating scales that use real-world data and performance data. And they use these high inference categories. And they have to be meaningful to raters and to speakers, and to be understandable in communicative terms. Now, this is not to say that I don't get the argument that goes, if I were asked to read a sentence in a language I don't know, I would do so slowly and hesitantly. That is true. And I can see the use in, say, reading out sentences for identifying individuals with language disorders. And in fact, that's what Galton did back in the 19th century. And I can even see the use of some of these tests that just translate observable variables into scores for beginner second language learners, for example. However, this does not justify the use of what I would call reductive deficit models for more advanced learners under the clarion call of objectivity, when what is really at stake here is the speed and economy of automated assessment. This undermines a view of society and individuals that Lardo would subscribe to, with the breakdown of that in terms of what I've described as real realism. Now, in terms of value systems and structures, I think this really shows a problem. When it comes to effect-driven testing, I believe in optimistic progress. And Fred Davidson and I have described effect-driven testing in this way. The task for the ethical language tester is to look into the future, to picture the effect the test is intended to have, and to structure the test development to achieve that effect. That implies that we do try to incorporate these value components and say, at the point of design, test design, and at that point we say, we owe a lot to Miss Levy in this sense, in the way in which he's created a hugely useful model for test design. When we're going through those processes, evidence-based test design, we state how we're designing it, what value systems we have, and what we expect the test to achieve in terms of its purpose. And as always, we should say what it should not be used for. If there are then consequences, we would have to look at those consequences and say, should this test exist for these purposes, or how do we mitigate those? It goes beyond just relevance and utility. One model of effect-driven testing would look something like this. Constructs are abstract names for complex ideas from observations. This is to explain how we understand the observational elements. And when it comes to constructs, in my 2015 book, following Charles Sanders Peirce and John Locke, on pages 129 to 139, I've defined a pragmatic notion of construct as the abstract name for a complex idea derived from observations of co-occurring phenomena, the purpose of which is to explain the coherence of our perceptions and make predictions about the likelihood of future events. The names of constructs are the signs of our ideas only, but no less the real for that. Truth, I don't believe in the truth of real realism, but I don't like the absence of truth in argument-based approaches. Truth is an ultimate argument supported by contingent, warranted assertion. We can never know that we have achieved truth, but we get as close as we can. When it comes to society, following a Lardo kind of model, it's achieving progress through questioning ideas, the freedom to engage with others, and to recognize that we are all similar and that language is part of our common heritage. So when it comes to individuals, it's learning through experience as free agents, and that language is about human communication. When I think about this, I always wonder about data in Star Trek. We're not likely to have a data in my lifetime, or probably for many lifetimes in the future. But even data still cannot understand language, because he does not share in our evolutionary common understanding of language. And power in this is shared, and it's about accountability for consequences. That brings me to the end of my Messick Memorial Lecture. I think that effect-driven testing, as Fred and I have talked about it, provides a way of integrating values into the way in which we conduct testing. I think it has to go beyond Messick's notion of construct validity. And I hope that in my analysis of the 4 main approaches to validity and validation that have evolved post-Messick, that I have shown where they lack something, and I hope that a consideration of effect-driven testing may help us to reintegrate some of those things and to understand how central an understanding of Messick is to how we move forward with questions of validity in language testing.